Welcome to this session of Answering the Call 2020, a public safety virtual summit from the Arbinger Institute. In this session, we're going to be discussing officer wellness. Desmond, why is this such an important conversation for us to have?
Well, it's amazing. The last part of my public safety career was spent as a licensed clinical therapist, really focusing on officer wellness and officer health. I designed several curriculums for law enforcement officers on different practices to stay healthy. So this is really meaningful to me. And Jason, Brent, and Corinne each bring a unique perspective that will be super helpful in bringing greater understanding to officer wellness.
Yes, as Desmond mentioned, we were joined by 3 panelists from all over the United States for this session today. It's such an important conversation, and they all really wanted to be a part of it. So we were joined by Corinne Dopp. Corinne is a sworn reserve law enforcement officer in North Carolina. She's also an emerging health policy professional. We were also joined by retired Chief Brent Newman, who recently concluded a 31-year career with the California Highway Patrol. Brent now serves with the Warriors Rest Foundation in support of concerns of police survivors. Finally, we're joined by Dr. Jason Wu. Dr. Wu has over 30 years of experience in multiple leadership roles as a commissioned corps officer of the U.S. Public Health Service. He is also the founder of Mindset for Results.
In answering this call and bringing these people together, we want to not only discuss the things they're currently doing, the knowledge that they can bring, but also how Arbinger principles can bring light and new resources to these difficult topics. So let's start with Dr. Wu. Jason, we want to talk a little bit about how does this all work from a medical standpoint. When we look at the physiological issues of things like depression or anxiety or trauma as it relates to law enforcement, when we look at the mental and psychological issues, how do they come together when we start looking at this body and mind system? What do we know about that?
Yeah, there are two things I think I would want to touch on related to. First is what we've learned in the medical profession as a whole, certainly in my 30 years in medicine. Certainly when I got started, there's a tendency to think of the head as separate from the body. But what we've learned over the last 20, 30 years really is that you can't separate from the mind from the body, right? Wellness of the body requires wellness of the mind and having that established connection. And so it's recognizing that we can't be physically well without really having a good sense of where our heads are at and being able to address compliance issues, and more importantly, all the neurobiological impacts of on the rest of the body from the stresses and strains that the nervous system can be under. The other aspect that I'd bring into the issue, particularly for folks in service areas, health, for example. One of my interests in getting into medicine 30 plus years ago was a lot of the stress. My mother was an anesthesiologist, and back at that time there were a lot of lawsuits, a lot of medical professionals who were having their careers jeopardized by just one or two bad cases. And the stress that type of system, where there's a lot of focus on perfection, can have, and the impact that has on the psyche of a person going through that. And I think this extends throughout folks who decide to go into a service calling, particularly in public safety and choosing to become a police officer. I don't think anybody goes into a service role thinking they're there to hurt anybody, right? They go into it because they have this higher calling, this desire to be helpful. The challenge is when the external environment changes, or the invitations within our everyday work environment, or even our training sometime, where there becomes more of a focus on particular actions. And unfortunately, we've certainly seen this in medicine as well, where the invitations around us to be focused on, quote, do a right behavior, is really shifted us away from seeing the folks that we are engaged with, and rather than being focused about doing the right thing for the person in front of us, is doing the right thing that keeps us from getting out of trouble. So
Oh no, absolutely, Jason. Thank you. I love your introduction in the compatibility um, of the collaborative efforts of the body and the mind together. Dr. Wu talked a lot about how trauma and these things play an effect in these service roles, in these roles such as law enforcement and public safety. What have you learned in your role, not just as a 30-year police officer, but in your current role as a trainer in trauma?
I think what happens is, having been, I was an academy commander at one point. I would see these new recruits come in, and you see exactly as Jason just said. You see the idealism. You see the how they had left careers where they were making 2 or 3 times what they were going to be making in law enforcement, but that they had a call. They had a sense from when they were a child that they wanted to engage and actually make society better as a peace officer. And then I got to see those cadets graduate and unfortunately lose a number through line of duty death. And then to start to see the impact of trauma as those trained and yet somewhat idealistic people began to interact with the world that they patrolled, the world that they interacted with. And of course, as they're receiving trauma, the difficulty about trauma is it's what you do with it. And so when you look at those same recruits 10 years later and 15 years later, there's a totally different sense about who they are. And you can see over time the impact of that law enforcement career and how it's affecting their mental health and their wellness. And they are the same person in a way, but they're much, much different.
That's an excellent comment. And I've worked in training as well, Brent and Dr. Wu, and I've recognized the same thing. We have people with this great capacity to want to do good and being willing to sacrifice, but then over the years they start to lose a little something about that. And so going to you, Corinne, you've been in that 5-year part, right? That 5-year point's really critical. I remember where you have enough experience, you're a little more comfortable in your job, but can you relate to maybe what some of these individuals are saying in terms of, I do feel maybe a little jaded than when I first started, and maybe it's not as idealistic as it was before.
I feel like I have a unique perspective on this because I sit on an intersection of public health and law enforcement. Public health is like they think about the population and vulnerable populations and people who are at higher risk of poor health outcomes. So the intersection for law enforcement and public health is looking at the law enforcement community and looking at, okay, they have a 21-year measurable life deficiency for life expectancy than the normal like American citizen. And they have that because of the physical and health costs of doing the job. You have hypervigilance, which is that hyper stress. And they can actually see now with brain scans that the stress long term, like a steady level of stress, lack of sleep, that kind of stuff, actually leads to the same PTS brain scans as someone who has that one traumatic brain injury. And it's the same on the brain scans. And so it's like there's this cost that happens along the way. And public health really focuses on studying the population and the needs of that underserved population or higher risk population. What's really interesting about the relationship between law enforcement and public health is that public health don't have teeth. They make policies, but who enforces the policies? Law enforcement. And so law enforcement has to be the teeth of that policy. And so thinking about that experience, like you go into a situation and you have to enforce policy and rules and laws that you may not completely agree with, but that doesn't matter because your job as a law enforcement officer, you're there to enforce what's the law. And so there's a lot of stress that comes on with that, and trying to do something like that while maintaining everything else.
Hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Brent, how would you define officer wellness?
So officer wellness is really, I'd say it's like a goal. It's when you're doing things in your life that are healthy practices, and you are putting systems and structures around you that regenerate and create ongoing health. The whole goal when you get into law enforcement, we say it from an officer safety standpoint that your goal on any particular shift is to get back to the office at the end of the shift. But your goal when you enter that academy is 25 or 30 years later is to graduate the career, not just the academy, but to do so in a way that your relationships are healthy, you're physically as healthy as possible, to the extent that it's within your control and influence. So when we talk about officer wellness, then what we're really talking about is the elements, the practices, the disciplines that go into those with the ultimate goal of making it to the end as a healthy and whole human being.
Yeah, Brent, I really appreciate you commenting about that relationship component. When I look at the healthcare field, I feel a lot of the challenges and the burnouts are happening around providers where we're losing connection to our patients. The system, I remember when I started, I would have 20 minutes for a new patient, and gradually that got cut down to 12 minutes and then to 7 minutes. And there was all these other checklists that became part of, a pain list, an education list, that we're starting to get more and more the way of my connection to my patients. And I think that's one of the drivers in medicine, particularly, that is relating to a lot of burnout. Be interesting in sort of your perspective and Corinne's as well, as when you're entering in that concept of connection and who that connection is to. Obviously family members, but when folks are choosing to serve, who do they feel they're coming in and trying to be connected to?
As law enforcement, we are answering calls for service. And so the connection happens with those that are involved in that call for service that we interact with. I think that's one of the hardest parts of the job, is trying to learn and gauge and do the best that you can with the time that you have and making those connections. Because although you may only have a short amount of time and you might have 4 calls pending, you want to give the quality that you can in the time that you have to be as helpful as you can. It's definitely a huge contributing factor to burnout and to feeling discouraged, because you want to do so much and you do the best you can with what you have. And then you go to the next call to try to do the best that you can with what you have.
Yeah. There's this capacity and desire to want to have some connection. And then we learn that often gets lost, and we see that we start looking at things like burnout, and we start looking at officers really not enjoying their jobs. And a lot of it comes from this inability to be able to connect. How does this inability to be able to connect and trauma go hand in hand?
Part of it occurs because externally, so there's 2 areas. Externally, because everybody that we're dealing with, in a shorthand way of saying it, they're either mad, bad, or sad. There's something that's going wrong. So what ends up happening is we interact with, obviously, people engaged in crimes, but even the best people of our society, the most principled, wonderful people, we're interacting with them when they're speeding, or they're drunk driving, or they've crashed and maybe it's their fault. And so over time, in a very insidious way, if you're not very aware of this, that begins to build a view of kind of humanity, because you're dealing overwhelmingly with all the negative situations. But the other side of it is the internal. With the internal aspect, what you have is officers will get disengaged because they're being led in such a way that they feel dehumanized. They feel that although it's very challenging out in the work environment, they when they came on, they kind of expected that. In fact, maybe that challenge is exactly why they came on. And yet now they're encountering things within the office, within their chain of command. Maybe it's a first line supervisor, maybe it's a lieutenant or the station commander, or even the chief or the sheriff, to where they're not being given understanding and support. Their actions are critiqued in an unhealthy way, or those types of interactions, to where a lot of officers tell me, and I had my own experience, where that internal stress is another really big factor in the overall sense of what we're talking about your wellness degrading.
No, that's an excellent comment. Thank you. So Corinne, as an officer, one of the reasons we have you here is that I know you've done some wonderful work in peer support. How does the principles involved with Arbinger help you in participating in peer support?
A lot of the literature that is out there about success inside law enforcement shows that you have to have that peer mentorship, because when you're in law enforcement and you're answering those calls and you have that hypervigilance and those things are active in your life, you sometimes get stuck. And those kind of connections can really help people come back from that tunnel vision that happens. It can make a huge difference in how you interact with each other on a team or how you interact with yourself. Communication is really important in general, but very important to law enforcement. You have to be able to communicate clearly. Arbinger gives a common lexicon that you can have conversations about that is really difficult to do if you don't have common terminology. So being able to put words on it and naming something is very powerful, and having that, so it opens doors. It opens doors to being able to start conversations, hard conversations that under stress are even more difficult. And so the way that Arbinger brings people together by giving that a name and common terminology in ways that we can see others as people and we can work together and collaborate, and a system in doing that is usable, is really important. And I think it's one of the biggest gifts that Arbinger gives.
Corinne, I love the way you structure that about just giving ourselves the ability to have the vocabulary to talk about these things. Because what we were just, or Brent, what you were just talking about earlier about how officers have a hard time acknowledging physicians. We have a hard time acknowledging when we have needs, right? When we're tired, when we're hungry. I mean, my 6-year-old knows when I'm tired and hungry because I'm grumpy. But we don't have a lexicon because those natural instincts give me, there's a self-preservation that has to go through, or I shouldn't say the self-preservation, but a self-care need that comes up. And I'm just less effective with him when I don't acknowledge that. And being able to help folks see that we need to be able to have this language around where we can say, hey, look, I'm a little bit inward. I've got this, recognizing those physical needs. I need rest, or I need, some downtime from this trauma that happened, or the events that happened either at home or on the job yesterday. Those show up in so many different ways. And we talk about separating work and life. It's, to me, it's the same thing that we did in medicine 30 years ago when we it goes back longer, but when we separate the head from the body, we can't separate work from life. Right, that is the nature where we're always in connection, and recognizing that we'll have those needs. A sick child, a sick parent, or a spouse that has an issue. Those things are going to carry into our job. We may be effective at doing what we think we're supposed to be, right? Continue to do the procedures, but we may not actually be effective in the outcome that we're supposed to be having. And so, the Arbinger material really has this ability to talk about this need to be seen as box, right? Whether it's a better than or worse than, or how we're seeing ourselves, right? Because if we're seeing ourselves as an object or as a need to be somebody in particular, we're not leaving space for those needs that happen, that are going to come up. And if we're not alive to ourselves, then we're really not going to be very effective at being alive to other people.
Well, thank you. And when we look at officer wellness, really being alive to ourselves is the best way to really gauge our wellness. Brent, what have you discovered in being an educator in trauma, trauma education, and supporting law enforcement officers across the country with the organization you work with? What are you seeing in terms of peer support?
Well, there's unquestionably, so Warriors Rest that I work with, we stand up peer support teams and do team building for agencies that don't have them or that need refresher. And in those teams, as they stand up those peer support teams, it has a dramatically positive impact on the organization. So it says something about the culture of the organization that sees the need for it and acts on the need. But that's kind of the organizational thing. You said something, Desmond, a little bit ago. You talked about being being alive to ourselves, and I love that phrase. And I like to think of it, if I could connect it with wellness, because what happens is if we're not taking care of ourselves, if we're not practicing good officer wellness, then what ends up happening is our ability to be fully alive to ourselves, let alone other people, is severely compromised. So it starts with basics like nutrition and hydration. So undergoing, you're in a pursuit, you're in kind of a conflict, you're in things, maybe a hot DV call that really elevates your all the stress chemicals that go on your body. Just washing that through by having a lot of water afterward has an incredibly good effect on you. One of the other things that trauma attacks is sleep. And sleep is the most profound impact on your ability to cope with trauma, your ability to recover from trauma, and trauma actually then affects sleep. So it's cyclical. So one of the questions that I like to ask people in helping them to become more aware of themselves and helping me as a peer to understand where they're at, I'll just ask, hey, how are you sleeping? Not how are you doing or anything. I'll just say, how's your sleep? Or I'll ask a spouse of an officer, how's he or she sleeping? And you'll get more honest feedback by that, not to mention the fact that we really need exercise. And that tends to that actually helps thwart the hypervigilance syndrome. All of those things kind of biologically we need, but the other things we need a support system. We talk about isolation is the enemy. And when officers have experienced trauma, officers are under a lot of stress, what they tend to do is isolate. And that first within their family unit, and then even within their family unit, they'll isolate from their spouse and kids. Those are steps toward bad outcomes. What we need is a support system. We need someone safe that we can talk to. That's why the peer support program is so important. We need to work through whatever it's going to take to be able to communicate effectively with our spouse. Some officers aren't comfortable. They don't want to regurgitate the really horrible things that happen, and they don't want to have their spouse hear that and maybe have secondary trauma. But you need to have a safe place, and robust peer support teams, that's exactly what that is. Someone who can understand, has a capacity to understand, and you can share and be understood. Because this whole idea about isolation, fatigue, lack of sleep in an era where officers are working incredibly long shifts, mandatory overtime, the nature of the duty is often in full riot gear, on front lines, hours of boredom, moments of terror. All of this is incredibly impacting to our officers. And I think their wellness needs to be acknowledged that, and then employ a strategy around these things with each other and as a team so that you can do what you're saying. We need to really be alive to ourselves, but it becomes very difficult if we're not practicing good officer wellness.
It's amazing, Brent. I've done a lot of specialized training in trauma and trauma support, and you just gave all the cliff notes. I wish I'd met you several years ago. You literally just gave all the cliff notes of what I would recommend.
I agree 100% that our rest, our ability to process and have that downtime, it's hard. We all live very, very busy lives. We have more, I'm sure in public safety, much like in health, there are all these checklists, all these tasks that we have to do, plus, in that personal work life, and there's just so much. We can rob ourselves of that when as long as we continue to have this idealized self-image of ourselves, where we are objecting of ourselves and holding ourselves to a standard that's just not physically possible. We have to be able to let go of these idealized selves, right? Because and often that's what makes it difficult for us to speak to somebody else, to begin to even have that conversation, because we have that need to be seen as this person that we think we should be, and it makes it hard to acknowledge that we may not be that. That's okay, right? And we have to help folks understand that and be able to have that conversation.
Excellent point. My motto is, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to recognize there's things we can implement to greater support our capacity. And like Officer Dopp has said, like Brent has said, I think we've all said it in multiple realms here, once we realize that we can take care of ourselves, our capacity to help others just goes higher and higher. One of the things I learned was that as I became, as the years ticked by in law enforcement, that almost unbeknownst to me, everyone was becoming some sort of an object. Whether it was the people I was spending time with, my fellow employees, my family, either you were helping me and being a vehicle I could use, or you were an obstacle, or you were in my way. And I really had to learn to address those things to get better, more meaningful relationships, which was also helpful for our well-being. What Arbinger principle or what Arbinger thing do you utilize on a day-to-day basis that helps enhance your overall well-being and your wellness?
For me, it's that one element about that's the core of this material, and the core of just being a better person and a happy person. It's connection. Connection is the core of what we are as human beings. Not the accolades, not all the doings. It's that connection. And where I think this is particularly relevant for officers in today's environment, where there's all this turmoil out there, it's get reconnected. Just find that way. Don't have this burden that you have of this idealized self, and find those folks who you can connect with, because that's where your humanity comes back, and that's where humanity really exists, that common connection.
In so many interactions that we have throughout the day, it starts with a choice. And there's this sense that you have inside you that you're supposed to do something. I'm going to illustrate this in two ways in a moment. And you either listen to that choice and act on it, or you betray it and you rationalize. And based upon where you go, by either honoring what your conscience, what your inner self is telling you to do, or betraying that, you start to go down a little road, even in that interaction, that makes the whole thing quite different. So I'll give you two quick examples. So if I'm a leader, and when I was in leadership positions, there was always a temptation, because you have staff, to, for example, to skip out on a duty. And here's what I mean. If I didn't like dealing with the press, I've got a public information officer that can do that. If I don't like to go to public meetings, I've got a resource officer that can go to that. If I didn't like to talk to the troops, then I could always have a meeting at division, or I could be otherwise legitimately busy during a training day when the captain would normally address the troops. But in every one of those cases, if I betray that sense, but my sense is you need to show up, you need to talk to the press, you need to do these things. And every time I betrayed that, what ends up happening is I would lose self-respect. And what ends up happening is, if you make enough of those decisions as a leader over enough years, it gets harder and harder to look in the mirror. And it begins to have a cumulative effect on your leadership effectiveness, because you have, maybe not even at a fully conscious level, you've lost some respect. Works the same way for officers and sergeants that are working the road. You have an inner sense that you're supposed to, it's not just a traffic stop, but you need to go the extra mile in this one, or you need to ask a question, or you need to render a little bit more or different service, because your finely tuned inner being is telling you to do that. And you have a choice at that moment. You either do it and really reap the good consequences that go with that. Life becomes an adventure when you do that. You get out of your comfort zone. Or what you do is you rationalize. You say, I'm tired. This is my nth call of the day. I don't have time for this. It's probably nothing anyway. You go through all these rationalizations. If you do that as an officer, for enough years over time, that loss of self-respect, it degrades your wellness. And it's one of those things that it definitely degrades your ability to cope with all that we're doing. Much of the joy in life, whether it's a leader or a frontline officer, is in listening to that inner self, taking what feels to you a little bit of risk, and then reaping the benefit of the fully human interaction that follows. So that's the thing, Desmond, that has been most meaningful to me. And I actually, it's so ingrained, it's like a personal accountability tool. But every time I do it, I come away going, boy, I am so glad I listened to that inner voice. And instead of going to war with people in my heart, I'm at peace, both with myself and with others.
The Arbinger principle that has been the most influential for me has always been the concept of we have a choice. We have a choice how we go into an interaction, and we have a choice to see ourselves and others as people. And that is the most powerful concept to me when I interact with a community and I'm able to make that choice. It really helps rejuvenate my motivation to serve and allows me to participate in the now and what's going on now with more presence and awareness, which enables me to make conscious decisions that are helpful so that everyone involved in the circumstance, we can all work together for common goals. And that's what Arbinger really empowered me and gave me the confidence to be able to do. And really, that concept in and of itself is what drove me to believe and put into action that I can serve not just the community that I work in, but the community of law enforcement itself.
We're thankful as an Arbinger organization that we can bring experts like you together and discuss difficult topics to secure and sure up law enforcement is something we're passionate about. And so thank you and each and every one of you for doing that.
Thank you to Corinne Dopp, retired Chief Brent Newman, and Dr. Jason Wu, who joined us for this very important session.
You know, we cannot say enough about the importance of officer wellness. It's directly correlated to officer effectiveness. And so we just want everyone out there who's listening to this to recognize and appreciate the fact that your wellness matters, your ability to do your job matters, and doing it in a way in which you can care for yourself at the same time is possible.